All right, Isaac, here we are once again. We're up to lesson 8. It's taking us a long time to get through it. We're covering a lot, you've got to admit. We're covering a lot of different aspects of it, and you need to know them all as we go through. So now we're going to go on to look at our criteria for determining the text that is authoritative. Now, this isn't textual criticism. We're not working the texts themselves out. We're just looking at what the textual critics have given us, and we're saying which one of these is authoritative, which one can we trust. And we're going to look at the different criteria for assessing the authority of the texts. And keep in mind that we've already looked at what Brad has to say, and we've dealt with the matter of the text with the better credentials, and I think we've totally convinced now that the TR has by far the better credentials of any of the texts. And then the historical dating method, we looked at that in Brad's thesis, and the historical usage method, we looked at that in Brad's thesis. So we'll begin, as we would do, with the last point that they used when they were looking to include scriptures in the canon, the reference method, because this is the method that is the most clear when we come to find out which text of the New Testament we think is authoritative. Clearly, the Masoretic text of the Old Testament references perfectly with the received text of the New Testament. Now, one of the things that put me onto this matter of the texts was the fact that I used Hodges and Fasted's New Majority Text translation for years. And I found when I come to preach that I couldn't reference it constantly. It happened all the time. It really worried me. So much so, in fact, that I was secretary of the church and I was a deacon and I was very involved in the preaching. And I went to the church and said, look, I cannot keep preaching. I can't be an officer in the church. I've got to sort out where I'm at, because I cannot make this version of the Bible that I've got reference from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Now, I couldn't work out why until I discovered the textual issue. And then I went back to the Old King James and it referenced perfectly. And that was one of the deciding things that made me understand this textual issue. So, clearly the Masoretic text of the Old Testament references perfectly with the received text of the New Testament. It does not reference well at all with any of the other texts, except inasmuch as when they are identical with the received text. Now remember, I talked to you and I said, when you come to Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and the Alexandrian text, they haven't got all the books of the Bible even, and a lot of the Bible's not even in them. So to make up their Bible and to make up their text, they add in parts of the TR. So naturally in those parts, it'll agree, right? And we expect it to agree. But every variant can be tested by this referencing method. Wherever it departs from the TR, we can test it by referencing, and we'll end up saying we should be using what's in the TR. Referencing from the Masoretic text will always bring us to the received text, the TR. Now, let's understand it. This method alone is sufficient to establish the received text, the TR, as the only text which can claim verbal inspiration, inerrancy, and infallibility. And as I study, and have studied all my life, I've studied in this way, that I've referenced the Old Testament to the New Testament, and time and again I've been totally convinced that the TR is the correct text because of the perfect referencing from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So if we use the reference method, it establishes the TR. The better credentials method, well, it's up to you to decide whether you think the Alexandrian text has better credentials, but we've shown that it's very poor that way. The historical dating method, well, we know that Sinaiticus and Vaticanus exist because they weren't used, because they were discarded, because they were corrupt. Right, the historical usage method. Now let's go on to number 5, the historical practice method. Now this method involves taking a historical setting in which a particular text is used and comparing it with a historical setting where the text is changed. And as we're dealing with the English-speaking world, it's logical that we use an English-speaking example. So let us take the historical setting from 1611 to 1890, when the authorised version, the King James Version, using the Byzantine received text, TR, of the New Testament was used, and comparing it with the period from 1890 to now. I've got 2007 here because I wrote it then, but in 2015. In this period, from 1890, the Byzantine received text has been abandoned and replaced by the Alexandrian text, represented by Textus Sinaiticus, Vaticanus and Beza, and we've got the NIV and all those versions, the Living Bible and all of them, and then the new majority text with the NASB. Now, I used the NASB for many years before I realised that it didn't come from the old majority text, it came from the new majority text. Right, the period from 1611 to 1890 was the time when the TR was used exclusively, the Textus Receptus, in the King James Version, and that was the time of the greatest Christian revivals in the world's history, not just the English-speaking world either. The English-speaking world was swept by revival. Great missionary zeal was apparent. All the great missionary societies were formed. Christian scholarship was at its height, and the Bible was translated using the Masoretic text of the Old Testament and the Byzantine received text of the New Testament into many of the world's major languages in countries such as India, China, Russia, etc. Let us understand that this period of great spiritual growth and revival was also built on the firm foundation of translations from this same text throughout Europe, beginning in 1534 when Martin Luther translated the Bible into German. Now what happened was Erasmus put his text together. The Catholics said it was wrong, but then the Reformation came. And when the Reformation came, all the countries that became reformed, that put aside the Roman Catholic religion and became reformed, they all looked to Erasmus's text that he'd put together and said, yes, we are going to make a translation from that text, just the same as we did in English. Right, Martin Luther translated in 1534 into German, and other European translations followed quickly. The French versions, the Dutch version, the Swedish version, the Spanish, the Danish, the Czech, the Italian, and this isn't an extensive list of countries that quickly benefited from this text, but gives us some background as we view our English language situation. Like, this business about the text doesn't just affect the King James Bible, it affects every Bible that was translated from Erasmus's text, which was for every country in Europe and half the world as the missionaries went out and translated the Bible. History clearly shows us that in all of these countries mentioned, the result of the release of these translations was always the same. It was like a ripple effect that went through all Europe. There was revival, there was missionary zeal, great missionary zeal, and great missionaries were raised up, and great men of God, and there was great Christian scholarship. Now that went on, and until the last 100 years. Now let's compare this with what's happened in the last 100 years. In the last 100 years, gradually in the English-speaking world, and in the rest of the Europe too, the Westcott and Hort's Greek critical text has been used to bring out new translations. And it's not just in English, and it's not just the King James, it's all over the world. And see, that's what they were after. They wanted the billions of dollars that would come from this. So we'll say that it's done now. So let's see what's happened in the last 100 years. Would anyone dare to suggest that spiritual and moral values are higher now than in the past? Would they? They would have to be out of their brain, wouldn't they? The moral values and spiritual values that dominate in the Western world now are as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah. They are as wicked as anything that the Bible describes where God judged people for their sin. Would anyone dare to suggest that we are living in a century of Christian revival in the Western nations? No, they wouldn't. In some of the Eastern nations they have revival. In China they're having revival. And in China people are being jailed and put to death for owning a Bible. And guess what that Bible comes from? Erasmus's text. That's what they're ready to die for, right? And people are being saved in their millions. Would anyone dare to suggest that the churches built last century are too small to accommodate the worshippers of this century? Are there more people going to church now than there were 200 years ago? Not very likely, are they? Would anyone dare to suggest that missions and missionary zeal have increased in the last century? In the last 100 years, 90% of missionary societies have closed down. Right? Think about that. Would anyone dare to suggest that Christian scholarship can be compared with that of the 1611 to 1890 period? Look back at your great Christian scholars of the past, and even up to the 1890s you had men like Dean Bergen, great scholars, among the world's greatest scholars. And what have we got now? We haven't got Christian scholarship. Everybody's relying on technology to try and keep up with the scholarship, but the men of the past had deep spiritual lives based on God's Word. And when we read what they write, we understand that they were real scholars. Right. The results speak for themselves. Method 5, which we're looking at, points very strongly to the Byzantine received TR text as being God's inspired, inerrant and infallible word. It comes down on our side of the discussion. Then the motive method. When the Bible was first translated into English, the Roman Catholic Church ruled the English-speaking world and all Europe. They bitterly opposed this translation, and those people involved in translating, printing and distributing the English translation, the people involved in this were excommunicated from the Catholic Church and burnt at the stake. Right? The great William Tyndale and his contemporaries, all Roman Catholics, right, gave their lives for the English translation, which was eventually authorised by King James. These were Roman Catholics and they were executed by the Roman Catholic Church, burned at the stake because they translated Erasmus's text into English. Right. Do we think they did this without considering which Greek text they used? Do we think they said, oh, I think I might translate the Bible into English. I know I'll be killed for doing it if I use Erasmus's text, but I'm going to use it anyway. Now, do we think they just did that without thinking about it? I don't think so, of course not. Erasmus, from 1469 to 1536, who was a Roman Catholic scholar, had compiled the Greek text of the New Testament, right, the Byzantine Received Text, TR, although he produced 5 editions which set the standard for the follow-up work done by Stephen, Beza and Elsner, and he had addressed all the relevant criteria in doing so. When Erasmus decided to put his text together in the Greek, not in the English, in the Greek, he was a scholar, and this was what he was doing for a living. And he sat down and he looked at all the relevant criteria for doing so. He was a Roman Catholic, so he had all the relevant manuscripts at his disposal, everything, right? Because the Roman Catholic Church owned them all. And despite extreme pressure from the Roman Catholic Church, he was able to demonstrate that this was indeed the correct text. Right, people in the Roman Catholic Church, the scholars in the Roman Catholic Church, argued with him, and Erasmus was able to defend his position so well that he silenced them all. Right, it has been argued by modern critics of the received text that we use, as compiled by Erasmus, that this text is based on a few relatively modern manuscripts, and Erasmus did not have available the textual evidence that's now available, namely Vaticanus V and Sinaiticus A. Now, is this actually true? No, this is not true at all. We know it's not true because, as a Roman Catholic scholar, Erasmus had available to him both the Syrian, the Byzantine, the Greek stream of textual evidence constituting the old majority text, and he also was a Roman Catholic. So of course he had the Western or Alexandrian text, the Latin stream of textual evidence. Of course he did, because it came through the Catholic Church, and he was a Roman Catholic priest. Of course he had it. It's clear from the correspondence of the Catholic, now Sepulveda, he was a scholar, and he wrote to Erasmus in 1533, and he recommended to him Codex Vaticanus B. Right? He said to him, you should be using Vaticanus B. Right? Now, but Erasmus, after due consideration, rejected it as corrupt. He had Vaticanus B. He looked at it and he said, no, it's corrupt. And he rejected it. Let us also note that Erasmus had available to him the Latin Vulgate of Jerome, which is based on the Alexandrian text from which Sinaiticus A and Vaticanus B are derived. So he not only had Vaticanus available to him, but he had the Latin Vulgate, which is the base of Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. So he had everything that he needed. And after due consideration, Erasmus also rejected this text in favour of the Syrian or Byzantine manuscripts. The response of the Roman Catholic Church was to execute anyone who tried to translate this text into English, and Erasmus was smart enough not to do that. But despite this incredible persecution, men like William Tyndale proceeded to translate this text into English and died because of their convictions. Right? They obviously thought it was the right text, didn't they? They obviously wouldn't die for it if they thought it was the wrong text. When King James decided to authorise the English Bible, he was the head of the Church of England, which was in fact the Roman Catholic Church in England. Right? That's what the Church of England was, and it still is, the Roman Catholic Church in England. Despite strong opposition from the Pope, King James had a group of the world's best scholars assembled, and under worldwide public scrutiny, they reassessed the criteria of the text, and once again, they rejected all but the Masoretic text of the Old Testament and the Byzantine received text, the TR, of the New Testament, thus giving God's word to the English-speaking world. Since the time of Erasmus, this text has been translated into many languages and always with the same results: revival, growing churches, great missionary zeal and great Christian scholarship. Let us compare this background with that of the new translations.